Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going on this fascinating journey through China, but not the China you usually see, in the news.
Right.
You requested this deep dive into Damien Ma and William Adams's book, In Line Behind a Billion People,
Hmm.
to understand China's future. Beyond those typical headlines about, economic superpowers and all that.
That's right. Yeah. This book it flips the script.
Yeah.
Instead of focusing on China's abundance and growth, it reveals these surprising scarcities that could really shape its future.
It's almost like we're looking at China through an X-ray,
Yeah.
seeing the potential weaknesses beneath the surface. And we're not just talking about obvious things like natural resources.
Right.
These authors, by the way, really know their stuff. Damien Ma is a fellow at the Paulson Institute focusing on China's political economy. And William Adams was an investment banker specializing in China. They're diving deep into scarcities of social capital, political freedoms, even potential marriage partners.
Yeah. It's kind of about understanding the pressures
Yeah.
that could really change China's course entirely. It all starts with a story that might surprise you. A story about car ownership.
Wait, car ownership.
Yeah.
Isn't China the world's largest car market?
It is now, but the book opens with this almost comical anecdote
Yeah.
about Beijing's traffic jams and the unbelievable scarcity of car ownership,
Yeah.
even for those who can afford it.
Oh, wow.
Imagine a system where you have to enter a lottery just for the chance to buy a car.
You're kidding.
Oh, yeah. That's precisely what Beijing implemented back in 2010.
Really?
Yeah, a license plate quota system to try and control the just out-of-control traffic. The book even describes people smashing dealership windows just to guarantee they get a car before the quota hit.
Wow, desperation on a whole other level. I can't even imagine competing in a lottery just to get a car. So how did China go from, people desperately trying to get cars to being the world's largest car market?
That's where the authors introduced this fascinating concept of the panda boom, a period of incredible economic growth from 1978 to 2011. They argue that this boom was fueled by very specific factors, some of which are ironically contributing to today's scarcity.
Okay, this is where it gets interesting. What were these factors?
Well, one crucial element was China's laser focus on controlling inflation. They kept prices stable, which encouraged both domestic and foreign investment, which propelled growth. But as we see with, skyrocketing housing costs today, once that control loosens, scarcity can hit hard and fast.
It's like a double-edged sword. Control helped fuel the boom, but also created vulnerabilities.
Precisely. And another factor was how China tackled inefficiencies in its state-owned enterprises. Think a massive overhaul starting in the mid-1990s, getting rid of price controls, allowing mergers, and forcing these companies to compete.
Sounds like a pretty aggressive approach. Did it work?
It was a huge gamble, but it paid off. Profits in the industrial sector just exploded, sevenfold between 2000 and 2010. This created this surplus of cash that was pumped back into development, further accelerating growth.
Oh, yeah.
But remember, this growth was happening on a landmass with a rapidly growing population.
Which brings us to a more fundamental issue, China's resource constraints.
Exactly. Land scarcity is a major headache, amplified by past mismanagement practices and breakneck urbanization. Imagine trying to squeeze a billion people, growing industries, and expanding cities all onto a landmass not much bigger than the U.S. It's a recipe for scarcity.
And then there's their, insatiable appetite for energy. You can't fuel an economic miracle without it.
You hit the nail on the head. China's thirst for energy, especially oil, has led them down some risky path, making them dependent on imports and vulnerable to global price swings. Think of their investments in politically unstable countries like Sudan, all driven by this need for secure energy resources.
So energy security is a major vulnerability. But what about something even more fundamental, like water?
Yeah. Water scarcity is a ticking time bomb. Pollution from rapid industrialization has tainted many water sources, and now competition between industry and agriculture for this precious resource is getting fierce.
Yeah.
Imagine the Yellow River, China's mother river, reduced to a trickle, its waters polluted by industrial waste. That's the reality of water scarcity in China.
That's a pretty sobering picture. It makes you realize how interconnected these scarcities are. But let's move on to something that directly impacts every single person in China. Food.
Right?
The way this book frames this issue is honestly kind of mind-blowing.
It really is. The book argues that China, after almost a century of battling hunger and undernourishment, now faces the challenge of an overfed middle class.
It's not just about people eating more, it's about what they're eating.
Exactly. The rapid shift to a meat-heavy diet is stretching China's capacity to produce enough food domestically.
Wow.
Think about the resources needed to raise enough livestock to feed that demand. It's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. And how does this impact the rest of the world? Are we talking about global food shortages?
So potentially, yes. China's demand for food can send shockwaves through global markets, driving up prices and impacting food security worldwide. Their internal scarcities become everyone's problem.
And this kind of reminds me of the melamine-tainted milk scandal back in 2008. Was that a turning point for China's awareness of food security?
Absolutely.
Huh.
It was a wake-up call that exposed serious flaws in their food supply chain, highlighting the dangers of prioritizing rapid growth over, safety and quality. Over 6,000 babies got sick from that contaminated milk.
Yeah.
A truly devastating consequence.
Yeah. It's heartbreaking. And then there's this unsettling detail about special food farms exclusively for government officials.
Oh yeah, that
Uh,
one really drives home the inequality in food access and safety. While ordinary citizens worry about, contaminated food, the elite enjoy their own secure supplies.
right.
It raises serious questions about priorities and the uneven distribution of resources.
We've talked about economic scarcity, food security, and the impact of resource constraints.
hmm
But what about the workforce? I always hear about China having this massive, almost endless supply of labor.
That was the story for decades, but hold on tight because things are changing. China is shifting from a labor surplus to a labor scarcity.
Hold on. Seriously. How is that even possible with a population of over 1.4 billion people?
It's a demographic time bomb. The one-child policy, which was in place for decades, has created a shrinking pool of young workers entering the workforce.
Oh, wow.
So fewer workers means
Yeah.
higher labor costs, and that's happening just as wages are rising across the board. And a new generation of workers is less willing to accept, poor conditions and low pay. They have different aspirations and expectations.
It's almost like China's economic miracle is running headfirst into a demographic wall. So what are companies doing? Are they packing up and leaving China?
Some are, but many are relocating to inland provinces where labor is still cheaper. But even there, wages are rising. It's a tricky situation, and it's putting the brakes on China's breakneck growth.
So China is grappling with economic pressures, food security concerns, and a looming labor shortage. Add to that a healthcare system under immense stress.
hmm The book paints a very stark picture of the healthcare situation, opening with a chilling anecdote about a doctor being stabbed by a patient.
Oh, God.
That's how bad the tension and frustration have become within China's healthcare system.
That's terrifying. But didn't China used to have a pretty good healthcare system? What happened?
They did, but as economic growth became the overwhelming focus, social welfare, including healthcare, took a backseat, funding was slashed, and hospitals were increasingly pushed towards a profit-driven model.
And that led to...
A rapid decline in the quality of care. This profit motive created these perverse incentives, leading to overprescribing of medications, unnecessary procedures, and a sharp increase in costs for patients. The trust between doctors and patients has eroded, and the system is struggling to cope.
It's a classic case of unintended consequences. So
Okay.
it's not just a lack of resources, it's a systemic issue. And as the population ages, the pressure on the healthcare system is only going to get worse.
Exactly. The book calls it a ticking time bomb.
Mhm.
And it's a stark reminder that economic growth without a solid foundation of social welfare is unsustainable.
So we've covered economic pressures, food security, labor shortages, and a healthcare system under immense strain. It's a pretty sobering picture of the challenges China faces.
Right.
What other scarcities does this book uncover?
Well, get ready for this one because it's about education. The book starts this section with a rather provocative question. What if you were a dictator? How would you maintain control?
Okay, that took a dark turn. But I'm curious, what does that have to do with education?
It's all about a concept called urban bias, which shapes the entire education landscape in China.
Urban bias, what does that mean?
It means the Chinese government prioritizes the well-being of urban residents over those in rural areas. And education is a key tool for maintaining this power dynamic. Think of it like this. Urban kids have access to better schools, more resources, and a smoother path to higher education.
So it creates this cycle where urban areas thrive and rural communities fall further behind.
Precisely. And this feeds into social stability because the urban population, benefiting from this system is less likely to challenge the status quo.
It's fascinating how education is used as a tool for, like, social engineering.
It's a powerful tool.
Mm,
And the book highlights the intense pressure within this system, symbolized by the Gaokao, China's notoriously difficult college entrance exam.
yeah.
It's like a pressure cooker for students with their entire future riding on this one exam.
Yeah, I've heard horror stories about the Gaokao. It makes our SATs look like a walk in the park.
It's a high-stakes game.
Yeah.
But there's another trend that further exacerbates inequality. Wealthy families sending their children abroad for education.
So those who can afford it are basically opting out of the system altogether,
Hmm.
leaving those who can't afford it to compete for increasingly scarce spots in a system that's already rigged against them.
You got it. It's a double whammy of scarcity and inequality.
This deep dive is starting to feel pretty intense. Maybe we should move on to something a bit lighter, like housing.
Don't expect a lighthearted conversation on this one either. Home is where the wallet is, as the book aptly puts it.
Well,
Housing prices in China have gone through the roof, enriching some while pricing many out of the market.
it's crazy how housing has become this central issue, not just in China, but globally. I can only imagine the pressure that puts on young people, especially in a society that places such high value on homeownership.
Yeah.
You know?
It's immense. Homeownership is often seen as a prerequisite for marriage, adding this whole other layer of stress. Imagine needing to own a home just to be considered marriageable.
Yeah, it's almost like another form of scarcity, a scarcity of affordable options.
Exactly. And the government is caught in this impossible balancing act of trying to increase affordability without upsetting powerful stakeholders like developers and wealthy homeowners who benefit from the current system.
Right.
It's a tightrope walk, for sure.
Okay. We've covered a lot of ground here. Economic pressures, food security concerns, labor shortages, and a healthcare system under strain, and the inequalities within the education system and the housing market. It paints a much more complex picture of China than what we usually see in the news.
We've only scratched the surface. The book goes even deeper, exploring the scarcity of freedom and ideology in China, arguably the most crucial aspect of all.
It's funny you should mention freedom and ideology, because we seem to have a scarcity of time right now. We'll have to dive into that fascinating topic when we return for part 2 of our exploration of In Line Behind a Billion People. Welcome back. I'm eager to dive into this next section because it gets to the heart of what makes China tick: freedom and ideology. It almost seems counterintuitive. You'd think with such incredible economic growth, there'd be this sense of, optimism, a clear vision for the future.
And that's precisely the paradox the book tackles. It argues that China's economic success has been accompanied by this scarcity of clear ideological direction, a lack of values that truly resonate with the people.
So it's like they've achieved this incredible material prosperity, but at the expense of a deeper sense of meaning and purpose.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
And to maintain stability in this kind of ideological void, the government has resorted to controlling information and restricting freedoms.
Yeah.
It's all about managing the narrative, right?
And this is where the book delves into this shadowy system called the Waiwen system, right? Can you break down what that is exactly?
Yeah, think of it as this massive, multi-layered system of social control. Stability maintenance on steroids. It's not just about censorship. It's this vast network involving everything from security forces and surveillance technologies to financial incentives that encourage self-censorship and discourage anyone stepping out of line.
Wow, that's a whole other level of control. It sounds incredibly expensive to maintain a system like that.
It is. The book estimates that local governments pour 3 times more money into stability maintenance than the central government. We're talking billions of dollars funneled into this system.
That's a staggering amount of resources being diverted from other priorities. But is it even effective in this day and age? Can you really control information and thought in the internet era?
That's the million-dollar question. The book acknowledges that despite the Great Firewall and this massive censorship apparatus, information still finds a way to slip through the cracks. And the rise of social media, platforms like Weibo, has created these new spaces where people can connect and express themselves, often in ways that challenge the official narrative.
But isn't Weibo heavily censored as well?
It is, but it's like this constant cat and mouse game. Chinese netizens are incredibly savvy at finding ways to circumvent censorship and share information. Remember the Windsor train crash back in 2011?
Vaguely. Remind me what happened.
It was a high-speed train crash that tragically exposed corruption and negligence within the railway ministry. The government tried to downplay the incident and control the story, but social media blew the lid off the whole thing. Images of the wreckage, stories of the victims all spread like wildfire online, despite the government's, frantic attempts to censor it. The public outrage forced them to acknowledge the disaster and respond.
So even with this vast Y1 system in place, the government can't completely control the narrative. That must be incredibly frustrating for them.
Absolutely. It shows the limitations of trying to maintain stability through, control and suppression. It's like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a broom. People are hungry for transparency and accountability, and they're finding ways to make their voices heard.
Yeah. And the book highlights a bunch of other incidents that really illustrate this growing public discontent and this desire for change. What were some of those examples?
Well, they talk about the protests in Shifeng back in 2012, where citizens took to the streets to oppose the construction of this molybdenum copper plant. They were worried about pollution and the health risks, and the government's initial response was to try and silence them.
Oh, wow.
But the protests quickly gained traction on social media, spreading awareness and galvanizing support. The government ultimately had to back down and cancel the project.
So it wasn't just about environmental concerns. It was about people demanding a say in decisions that impact their lives and their communities.
Exactly. It was a real turning point.
Yeah.
The book also discusses the protests in Ningbo against this planned oil refinery expansion. Again, environmental concerns were at the forefront, but it was also about challenging the government's, a top-down decision-making process. Social media fueled the protests, and despite attempts to suppress dissent, the message got out, and the government faced a major public relations crisis.
It seems like China's leaders are in a tough spot. They've built this system on control and stability, but that's becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The people are demanding more say, more transparency.
It's a real dilemma. And then you have this ideological void we talked about earlier. The book takes us on this journey through the different ideological phases China has gone through since 1949. It's like this constant search for a Chinese modernity, a way to define what it means to be Chinese in this rapidly changing world.
That's fascinating. Can you walk us through those phases?
Well, you had the Mao Zedong era, which, emphasized communist revolution and collectivism. Then came the Deng Xiaoping era, which ushered in economic reforms and opening up to the world. That led to the incredible growth we've seen, but it also created this kind of ideological vacuum.
So Deng's focus on pragmatism and economic development left a gap in terms of values and beliefs.
Exactly. There was no clear set of values to replace the communist ideology that had, lost its appeal for many. There were attempts to fill this void, of course. Hu Jintao, the former president, introduced the concept of a harmonious society,
Right.
focusing on social stability and, addressing inequality. But did it work? Did it resonate with the public? Not really. In practice, the focus remained on economic growth, and inequality continued to widen. The book suggests that the harmonious society idea was more about maintaining control than achieving, genuine harmony.
So we're back to this issue of control. But what about the current leadership? Doesn't Xi Jinping talk about the Chinese dream? What's that all about?
He does, and the book examines this idea as well, questioning its effectiveness and resonance with the public. It sees the Chinese dream as another attempt to fill this ideological void, but one that lacks clarity and substance.
So where does that leave China? What's the takeaway from all of this?
The book doesn't offer easy answers, but it presents this stark reality. China's future won't just be shaped by its, economic power, but also by these deep-seated scarcities. Scarcity of resources, scarcity of trust, and perhaps most importantly, scarcity of freedom and a unifying ideology.
So what does that mean for the average person trying to, navigate life in China?
The book highlights this growing frustration and disillusionment among certain segments of society. There's this sense that the old social contract, where people accepted limitations on their freedom in exchange for, economic prosperity, it's breaking down. People are demanding more say in their lives, more accountability from their leaders.
And what's been the government's response to this growing discontent?
The response has been to double down on control. They've expanded surveillance, tightened censorship, and intensified their efforts to stifle dissent. But as we've seen from those examples in Wenzhou, Shifang, and Ningbo, this approach can backfire, fueling even more resentment and unrest.
It's fascinating how this this tension between control and freedom is playing out in China. While we've been discussing these big abstract ideas, I keep thinking back to this poignant anecdote the book shares about a man and his dog.
I don't recall that story. Tell me about it.
This man's golden retriever was about to be euthanized by the authorities because of complaints from a neighbor. And in this desperate plea to save his dog, he lays bare the frustrations of everyday people trying to live their lives within this system.
It sounds heartbreaking. What did he say?
He talked about his health problems and how his dog helped him, get exercise and improve his quality of life. He talked about how he always cleans up after his dog and how the complaints were completely unfounded. And then he said something that really stuck with me. He said, if it is killed, how am I going to live?
Wow. That's powerful. It speaks to a sense of powerlessness, this feeling that the system is rigged against them. That even the simple joy of owning a pet can be taken away by arbitrary rules and uncaring authorities.
Exactly. It's a reminder that these grand narratives about China's rise often overlook the lived experiences of individuals who are trying to make sense of these rapid changes and find their place in this new China.
It's so easy to get caught up in the big picture and forget about the human cost. But the book doesn't let us forget. It ends on this very thought-provoking note, presenting this stark choice facing China's leaders.
What choices are those? What does the future hold for China? I guess we'll have to find out in part 3. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into In Line Behind a Billion People. We've uncovered a lot about China's hidden scarcities, from, resource constraints to this growing tension between control and freedom. But the big question remains, what does the future hold? You left us hanging with this stark choice facing China's leaders.
Yeah, the book lays out this critical juncture where China's leaders face these two distinct paths, right? They can either summon the political will to address these scarcities head-on, embracing these significant reforms, even if it risks some instability, or they can cling to the status quo, maintaining tight control, but potentially facing deeper social divisions and even greater instability down the line. It's a high-stakes gamble either way.
So are they going to double down on control or embrace change? Does the book offer any insights into which way they might lean?
Well, the authors don't have a crystal ball, of course, but they do suggest that the current leadership under Xi Jinping might be more inclined toward bolder reforms. They point out that, Xi has acknowledged the need to tackle corruption, reduce inequality, and make the economy more sustainable. There seems to be a recognition that the old model is reaching its limits.
So there's a glimmer of hope for a more equitable and just China.
It's possible, but the book also cautions that any meaningful reforms will face strong resistance from powerful vested interests who, benefit from the current system.
Who are we talking about here?
Think about the elites who've amassed, wealth and influence under the current system, the politically connected, those controlling access to resources and opportunities. They have a lot to lose if things change.
So it's a classic power struggle. Reformers versus the status quo, and the outcome will determine China's future. Let's explore those two scenarios you mentioned, the optimistic one and the pessimistic one. What does the optimistic scenario look like?
Well, in the optimistic scenario, China's leaders embrace this bold reform agenda, right? They take concrete steps to tackle corruption, reduce the dominance of the state sector, and invest heavily in social welfare programs like healthcare and education. It's about creating a more level playing field where everyone has a chance to succeed, not just the connected few.
How would those reforms address the scarcities we've been discussing?
The authors argue that such reforms could actually alleviate some of these scarcities. For example, reducing the power of the state sector could free up resources to address issues like land and water scarcity. Investing in social welfare could lead to a more stable and harmonious society, lessening the need for such heavy-handed control. It's about creating this virtuous cycle where reforms lead to greater prosperity and well-being for more people.
That sounds promising. But what about freedom and ideology? Can China really achieve, economic prosperity and political freedom simultaneously?
That's the billion-dollar question. But the book suggests that China might be at this tipping point where the old model of authoritarian capitalism is no longer sustainable.
Okay.
The scarcities we've been discussing are creating this immense pressure for change.
So it's reform or risk even greater instability. What happens in that pessimistic scenario where China's leaders cling to control?
Well, that path leads to a much darker outcome.
Yeah.
Inequality continues to grow, corruption festers, And social unrest bubbles over. The government, feeling threatened, cracks down even harder, expanding surveillance, tightening censorship, crushing dissent.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster, a descent into authoritarianism and stagnation.
It could very well be. The book suggests that if China goes down this path, it risks becoming this stagnant and unstable power.
Yeah.
Economic growth could stall, and those social divisions we've been talking about could erupt into widespread conflict.
Wow, that's a pretty grim outlook. Reform and progress versus stagnation and instability. It's a stark choice with global implications. This deep dive has been incredibly thought-provoking, but I have to admit it's also a bit unsettling.
It's understandable to feel unsettled. China's future is uncertain, and the choices its leaders make will impact not just their own people, but also the world. But I think it's important to remember that the book ends on a note of hope. It argues that China still has the potential to forge a new path, one that leads to a more sustainable, equitable, and free society.
That's reassuring. It reminds me of that story about the man and his dog fighting to hold on to a small piece of happiness in a system that often feels overwhelming and arbitrary.
That story really gets to the heart of what's at stake here. It's about the lives of ordinary people,
Yeah.
their hopes, their dreams, their struggles, these grand forces we've been discussing, scarcity, inequality, control, they all have real-world consequences for real people.
Well, there you have it, folks. A deep dive into In Line Behind a Billion People, a book that challenges our assumptions about China and forces us to confront the complexities of its future. What struck you as most surprising or insightful? What further questions do you have about China's future? This deep dive is just the beginning of your exploration. Keep diving, keep questioning, and keep learning.